I teach a subject here at Tabor called Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. It's a fantastic subject, although I have to confess I actually say that about all the subjects that I teach. Okay, it's a fantastic subject. Lots of different things that we do in that subject that all focus around equipping people with the knowledge and skills they need to be a better interpreter of God's Word. Now, one of my favourite lectures, and I have to acknowledge that I do get told by my students that a lot, okay, that every time I introduce a lecture, I say, this is my favourite lecture. But one of my favourite lectures actually has to do with Bible translations. You know? Why are there so many? What are their strengths and weaknesses, and which one should I use? Now, one of the key points that I make during that class is that if you are working with a translation, the act of interpretation does not actually begin with you, okay? We tend to think that because we've got the Bible in front of us and that we're reading through it, that the act of interpretation begins with what we are doing, okay? But that is simply not the case. If you are working with a translation, that will actually have been produced by an individual or a translation committee, and they have themselves had to make all sorts of interpretive decisions to produce the translation that you have in front of you. Okay? They have had to make interpretive decisions about the meaning of words. They've had to make interpretive decisions about how to translate certain grammatical structures. And so our work is not the start of the interpretive process. We actually join the process halfway through. Okay? Now, I want to suggest that a similar process is at work when it comes to cultural engagement. Okay? We've often been led to think that our role as Christians is to apply the Bible to the contemporary context, okay? That the process of cultural engagement begins with us, as it were. But I want to argue that that's actually a faulty understanding. That's simply not true. That we are actually joining the process halfway through, okay? You see, the process of the production of the Bible was itself, at least in part, a process of cultural engagement, okay? That the biblical authors themselves were listening to what was happening in the world around them, and they were actually drawing on that to tell God's story, okay? And I think there is perhaps some lessons about how they went engaging with their culture that we can pick up and consider for today as well. We cool so far? Great. Remember, any questions in through Slido if you want. Okay. So this afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to explore various pop culture artefacts. You know, you've got the different ones that you can choose to look at. But this morning, I want to look at an ancient equivalent, okay, an ancient pop culture artefact. This artefact was well known in the ancient world. In fact, we find evidence for this artefact pretty well everywhere you see on that map, okay, all the way from Greece through to ancient Turkey, across into Syria, Israel, and even all the way across to Mesopotamia, okay? Interestingly, it is still a pop culture artefact that is still with us today, okay? We find echoes of it in contemporary pop culture in the world around us. Let me give you two examples. If I was to get you to name a secret terrorist organisation which has as their motto, and I've got to admit, when I was writing this lecture and I wrote the sentence, secret terrorist organisation with a motto, I smiled and thought, only in comics, okay? But a secret terrorist organisation which has as their motto, if a head is cut off, two more shall take its place, Hail Hydra. Okay, so one example. Okay. Ancient pop culture artefact that is still around with us today, Hydra. Okay. Or if you'd grown up in the 80s like me, you may recognise that at all. Does anyone know what it is? Tiamat from the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, okay? Maybe you never saw the maybe you were never allowed to watch the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. I certainly grew up in a household where Christians didn't have anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons. Although, ironically, one of the main creators of Dungeons and Dragons, a guy named Gary Gygax, actually died as a committed Christian. But yeah, that's Tiamat from Dungeons and Dragons. So let me unpack this pop culture artefact for you, this ancient pop culture artefact for you. Essentially, it's a well-known story, okay? It's a story about conflict between the gods, about conflict between order and chaos. Now, there would have been some variation in this story from place to place, from region to region. So some of the names of the key characters changed as you went around the world. So the name of the monstrous antagonist of the narrative in Mesopotamia was Tiamat. In Syria, she was known as Litanu. The Greeks called her Hydra. In the Bible, she is known as Leviathan and Rahab. So the names change sometimes from version to version. And some of the versions add different elements and omit others. They're not identical. But if you'd grown up in the biblical world, the ancient Near East, sometime around the turn of the first millennium BC, you probably would have known a story that went something like this. Okay. Now, the antagonist, the big baddie of the narrative, was a female sea serpent or a dragon. Her name varies from text to text, and so does her description. In some texts, she appears with 4 eyes, a horn and a tail. In others, she is described as a twisting serpent, a crooked serpent, the mighty tyrant with 7 heads. Now, something happens to enrage the sea dragon. In one of the stories, it's that her consort is murdered. And so she vows to take vengeance against the gods. And she gathers around herself an army of fearsome monsters. And so the gods are threatened by this great sea serpent, sea dragon. And so they turn to a new champion, who is usually the god of the storms. And eventually this god agrees to be their champion on one important condition, okay? That if he is victorious, he will be elevated to the position of head of the pantheon, okay, the supreme god. The gods agree to the demand of their champion, and they provide him with all kinds of weapons, including a net, a bow and a war club. And as I was trying to picture that in my mind, he must have kind of had his hands full because he's also got a shield and his armour that he's wearing at the same time. So the champion goes out to challenge the sea dragon in single combat. And he begins by taunting her. We actually get some kind of parallels with this with the story of David and Goliath when they engage in single combat as well. But he taunts the sea dragon, and she becomes enraged, and she rushes forward to attack him, leaving her monstrous army kind of behind her. And as she's running towards the champion, he casts his net over her, and as she opens her mouth in a vain attempt to consume him, he drives the storm wind into her mouth. Okay? And that leads to her kind of being inflated a bit like a balloon. And he kills her by piercing her with one of his arrows of lightning. Okay? And that leads to her death. He casts her dead carcass to the ground and he stands upon it in triumph. Now, in the Mesopotamian version, this is actually linked with their story of creation. And what happens is that the champion picks up the body of the defeated foe, cuts it in half, and uses half to form the heavens and the other half to make the earth. Okay. Now, my hunch is that this story is a little bit like an ancient equivalent of Batman's origin story. Okay. Batman has so entered our society's consciousness that people who have never read a single Batman comic, they know his origin story. Okay? They know that his parents were shot by a mugger as they were leaving a show, that Bruce Wayne saw the whole thing, that he was left as an orphan, that he was brought up by Alfred. That's kind of permeated our consciousness. Okay? Now, very few people in the ancient world would have ever read that story that I told you about, a conflict between a champion and the sea dragon. But they would have been aware of it because of the cultural context in which they grew up. Okay? It was simply kind of in the air. It was this story that virtually everyone knew. So how do the Old Testament authors engage with this cultural artefact? Let me begin by saying that there is no single answer to the question. They engage with it in different ways depending on their purpose and their context. But here's kind of three broad categories. First of all, the biblical authors allude to this artefact. And in case you're wondering, I've got a definition there for an allusion. It's a passing or casual reference, an incidental mention of something either directly or by implication. So in these cases, the biblical authors kind of just mention this in passing, and they assume that their audience is going to get what they're talking about. We find an allusion here in the book of Job, Job 7, 11 to 12. Okay. You probably know that the book of Job is actually made up of a series of conversations between Job and his, in inverted commas, friends. I've always thought that's an interesting title to give these three compatriots of him, because with friends like those, who actually needs enemies? But Job 7 isn't actually part of the conversation with the friends, okay? It's actually Job speaking to God directly, okay, and kind of saying that I'm not going to give up. I'm going to continue my lament, my complaint against you, okay? Therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the dragon that you set a guard over me? Okay. Now you see there's no real unpacking of the myth. There's no explanation of it. They simply allude to it and expect that the author is going to understand what they're talking about. Okay. The reference to setting a guard probably connects with the Syrian version of the myth. In the Syrian version, the sea dragon wasn't killed. It was actually captured and put into prison, and someone stood guard over it. Okay. That's one example there. Another example is Job 26. Okay. This is the final speech of Job to his three friends, and here he kind of emphasises the majestic power and awesomeness of God. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he struck down Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Got a little bit more here to work with in terms of the story. A little bit more is explained. Particularly interesting is the reference to wind and to piercing the serpent, because that's very similar to the Mesopotamian version in particular. I just want to draw your attention to two key verbs in verses 11 and 12. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. With this in mind, let's jump to the New Testament, and in particular the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. This is the well-known story of Jesus stilling the storm as he and his disciples travel across the Sea of Galilee. Listen to this story now in light of the conflict myth and what we're finding there in Job 26. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The pillars of heaven tremble and astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Here we have a narrative in which there is chaotic, threatening waters. Here is a narrative where we have Jesus rebuking the wind and telling the sea to be still. Do you think there's echoes of this Old Testament artefact here? Yep. And what does it lead them to ask? Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Who is the person who calms the storms in the Old Testament, who defeats the sea? It's Yahweh. Who is this Jesus who is doing what the God of the Old Testament does? Okay. Or if we jump to Mark 1, 23 to 25, this is the story of Jesus healing the man with an unclean spirit. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed and they kept on asking one another, "What is this?" What does Jesus do? Jesus rebukes him, saying, "Be silent." Just as the Old Testament, we had the conflict between God and the forces of evil personified in the chaos sea dragon, so too do we have conflict between Jesus and the forces of evil. This time it's not a dragon though, it's a evil spirit. So, to summarise, the first way the biblical authors engage with this pop culture artefact is that they simply allude to it. They mention it in passing. The second thing is that they adopt and adapt this artefact. Okay? They draw on it, but they actually change it, and sometimes quite significantly. The best example of this, I think, is Isaiah 27:1. This is part of a series of oracles that describes God's future redemption of Israel. On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Parallels between this text and a text from the ancient Canaanite city known as Ugarit are quite striking. This is one of their texts. "You, Baal, smote Latanu, the slippery serpent, finished off the twisting serpent, the mighty tyrant with 7 heads." The Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Finish off the twisting serpent, the mighty tyrant with 7 heads, and I've got it up there a little bit more in terms of the overlap between them. There is, though, a couple of key differences between the texts. What's one of the most obvious difference? Sorry? Who's doing the activity, isn't it, okay? You know, that's on one level. We've got the Lord here, Baal, the Canaanite god of the storms there. The other key difference is the timing of this event, okay? What's the tense when we're dealing with the Ugaritic passage? Past tense. You smote. It's a past activity, the slippery serpent. What is it in the Isaiah passage? It's a future activity. So this is an artefact that has been picked up and transformed by Isaiah and pushed in the future to describe God's ultimate, supreme triumph over evil. And in this context, it's interesting to see how the pop culture artefact is picked up and is actually used in the book of Revelation as well, okay, to describe some of God's opponents in Revelation 12 and 13. Revelation 12, we have a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. What was it back there from Ugarit? The slippery serpent, finish off the twisting serpent, the mighty tyrant with 7 heads. A great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away from the flood. And Revelation 12 also describes this conflict that take place between the forces of God and the forces of the dragon. But it's interesting in Revelation 12 because it's not actually the Lord who directly fights the dragon. Anyone know who fights the dragon in Revelation 12? Michael. So what's happening here? We've actually got a champion coming on and taking the Lord's place to fight the dragon. Okay. And we also find references to this myth in Revelation 13. Then the dragon took his stand on the sea of the seashore, and I saw a beast. Where does it come from? Rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. Okay. I think we're getting allusions to this artefact, not just in the Old Testament, but also in the New. Okay, the final way the biblical authors engage with this artefact is that they invert and subvert it. They kind of change it to the point where they turn the narrative almost completely on its head. And in these passages, we still have mention of God and the serpent or the dragons or the sea monsters, but the relationship between the two is very different. No longer is it really a relationship of conflict. Instead, the sea monster or dragon simply appears basically as the Lord's pet. Psalm 104, 24 to 29. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide. Creeping things innumerable are there. Living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. Simply a pet of God that he has created, that he allows to play in the sea. Or another example would be in the first creation account that we find in Genesis 1. Here we have a reference to sea monsters in the plural. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas and let birds multiply on the earth. No sense of hostility, no sense of conflict, no sense of threat. These are God's pets, God's servants. Okay, almost finished. How might this shape the way that we engage with contemporary pop culture? So we've seen how the biblical authors did it. How might that shape the way that we go about doing it today? Okay. So what are the lessons that we can learn? The first lesson is do it. Okay? Engage with pop culture. Okay? That's what we can take away from the biblical authors. Engaging with the pop culture is not something to be afraid of. It's not something that we need to avoid. It's not something that we need to hide away from. The Old Testament and the New Testament authors repeatedly draw from the pop culture of their day. We've just looked at one example. That was just one illustrative example. I could have looked at multiple different examples of where we see this happening in the Old and the New Testament. When God chooses to reveal himself to his people, he does so in a way that's going to connect with them. When he spoke through Isaiah, he spoke in a way that was going to connect with 8th century Israelites. When he spoke through Paul to the church at Ephesus, he spoke in a way that a 1st century Greco-Roman audience would understood. When he spoke through Jesus, he spoke in a way that people mostly understood, although there's a little bit of confusion that pops up in Jesus' speech, but eventually, the people tend to get it. When God speaks, he meets people where they're at. He speaks in a way that they can understand. This includes using the pop culture of their day. It's good enough for God. Maybe we can take a leaf out of that book as well. So, do it. That would be my first encouragement to you. My second encouragement would be... whoops, shouldn't have jumped ahead. Do it critically, okay? Do it, but do it critically, okay? So the conflict narrative is not just picked up and adopted holus bolus by the biblical authors. In each and every passage, there is at least one significant change that takes place. It's no longer Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. It's no longer Baal, the god of the Canaanites, that is doing the defeating. It is always Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. They use it critically. Pop culture may provide a language for us to speak. It may provide metaphors and images that are useful for conveying what we say about God's work in the world, for what we say about the gospel. But there are things here that we won't be able to affirm that go against what we believe, and these elements need to be called into question. They need to be lost or perhaps transformed. So that was my second suggestion. Do it critically. My third suggestion would be do it creatively. Okay? So the Old Testament authors engage with the pop culture of their day in all kinds of creative ways. They're not constrained by the artefact. They feel free to transform and adapt it. They feel free to transcend it, to turn it on its head. That Genesis 1:21 would have sounded absolutely amazing to its original hearers. I've kind of got myself, an Israelite who is hearing this for the first time. You're telling me that the sea monsters are not hostile opponents to God, but simply his pets? What an awesome God we worship. Okay? They use it creatively in order to convey their point. And so I think for us today, there is space for how we go about engaging with pop culture, that we can do so creatively, that we can draw from it, but change and transform it to suit our purposes. Dave Benson's going to get up here later on and do a presentation. A really good example of a creative engagement with pop culture. Sorry, I'm only dropping you on this at the last minute. Dave has done a gospel tract which basically looks like Sin City. Okay, so if you know the movie, it's the black and the white and the red. And so to try to convey the gospel, but doing in a way that's creative, that draws from pop culture. And my final suggestion, how am I going for time, Melinda? Fine, okay. Is to do it contextually, okay? So do it critically, do it creatively, and do it contextually as well. I began by saying that the Old Testament authors do not use the artefact in a single, uniform, monolithic way. They feel free to adapt it. They feel free to change it to suit their purposes. Okay. So I'd encourage us to be flexible in the way that we use our contemporary pop culture artefacts, to consider how we might want to shape them to meet our context and our needs. In biblical interpretation, there is one answer to any question I ask in that class, okay? I feel a bit like a heretic because whenever anyone takes a theology class, the answer to that, any question you get asked in that class is Jesus, okay? Whenever you take one of my classes, Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, the answer to any question is context, okay? Context is king. So the way that you understand the Bible is via reference to its context, its historical context and its literary context. But there's also a third really important context, and that's the context of our audience, the context that we're addressing, okay? We need to consider our context if we actually want to be a good communicator of God's word. And so that would be my encouragement when it comes to using pop culture artefacts as well. Pay attention to your context. Where are they at? What's their issues? What's their challenges? What do they know? And allow that to shape the way that you use and draw on the artefact. So, do it critically, do it creatively, and do it contextually. That's me done.